You know those moments in life when everything feels like it's crashing down at once? When you're so tired you can barely remember your own name, when the weight of the world sits heavy on your shoulders, and when one more thing, just one more thing, might be enough to break you completely. That's exactly where Sophie Mitchell found herself on a cold Tuesday morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. She stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the airport restroom, staring at her reflection in the smudged mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. Dark auburn hair that she tried to smooth down but still looked messy. Blue eyes with circles underneath so dark they looked like bruises. At 32 years old, Sophie looked like she'd lived twice that long. And maybe, in a way, she had. She gripped the edges of the sink, taking slow, deep breaths. Her hands were shaking, whether from exhaustion or fear, or the 3 cups of bad coffee she'd downed that morning. She wasn't sure. Probably all three. Sophie had been working double shifts at Riverside Diner for months now. Sometimes she worked breakfast and lunch, sometimes lunch and dinner. Sometimes, when things got really desperate, she worked all three. Her feet ached constantly. Her back hurt. She smelled like grease and burnt toast no matter how many times she showered. But she did it anyway, because she had to. Because she had Lily, her 7-year-old daughter with the bright smile and curious eyes, and endless questions about everything. Her little girl who deserved so much more than Sophie could give her. Who deserved new shoes instead of hand-me-downs. Who deserved a mother who wasn't always exhausted, always stressed, always one emergency away from falling apart completely. Sophie's rent was 3 weeks overdue. Lily's dental bills were piling up on the kitchen counter, each one a reminder of what Sophie couldn't afford. Her beat-up Honda had finally given out last month, leaving her dependent on buses and the kindness of coworkers for rides. She was drowning, and every time she thought she might catch her breath, another wave pulled her under. And then, 2 nights ago, the phone call came. She'd been washing dishes after her evening shift, her hands raw and red from the hot water, when her phone buzzed. Uncle Robert. She'd almost let it go to voicemail. She was so tired. And she knew Robert would want to chat, to catch up, to ask about Lily, but something made her answer. Sophie, his voice had cracked over the line, and immediately she knew. You need to come. Now, your father, he's not doing well. The doctors say it could be any day now. The plate she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered in the sink. Her father, James Mitchell, the man who had raised her when her mother left, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike, how to change a tire, how to stand up for herself even when the world tried to push her down, the man who had been her rock, her anchor, her hero. He was dying. Sophie had known he was sick. Of course she knew. He'd been diagnosed with cancer 8 months ago, but he'd sounded fine on the phone. Strong, optimistic. He'd told her not to worry, that he was fighting, that he'd beat this thing. And Sophie, drowning in her own problems, had believed him because it was easier than facing the alternative. She thought she had more time. But time, Sophie was learning, doesn't care what you think. Time doesn't wait for you to get your life together, to save enough money, to be ready. Time just keeps moving, relentless and uncaring, and sometimes it runs out before you even realize it. She had to get to Boston. She had to see him. She had to tell him she was sorry for not visiting sooner, for being so caught up in her own struggles that she'd neglected the one person who had never, ever neglected her. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, but the biggest one was simple. Sophie didn't have the money for a last-minute flight to Boston. She'd stared at her bank account that night, at the pathetic number staring back at her, and felt something inside her break. She'd called Uncle Robert back, her voice shaking, and told him she couldn't afford to come. The shame in those words had tasted like ash in her mouth. Sophie, Robert had said gently, I'm buying you a ticket. Don't argue with me. Just get on that plane and come see your father. That's all that matters. So here she was at Chicago O'Hare, looking like death warmed over, about to board a flight she couldn't afford to a city she hadn't seen in 2 years, to say goodbye to the man who meant everything to her. But first, she'd had to say goodbye to someone else. That morning, she'd knelt down in front of Lily in their tiny apartment. Her daughter had wrapped her small arms around Sophie's waist so tight it hurt. Tears streamed down Lily's face, and Sophie had to fight to keep her own tears from falling. "Mommy, why can't I come with you?" Lily had asked, her voice breaking. "I don't want you to go." Sophie had cupped her daughter's face in her hands, forcing herself to smile even though her heart was shattering. "Sweetheart, I promise I'll call you every single day, okay? And I'll bring you back something really special from Boston. Something amazing. Would you like that?" Lily had nodded, but she was still crying. "When are you coming back?" "Soon," Sophie had lied, because the truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know if her father would recover, if she'd be planning a funeral, if she'd be staying in Boston to settle his affairs. She didn't know anything except that she had to go, and she had to leave Lily behind. Marcus, her ex-husband, had been standing in the doorway, watching, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same impassive expression he'd worn throughout the last year of their marriage. They'd divorced 3 years ago after everything between them had turned toxic. The love they'd once shared had curdled into resentment, the trust shattered beyond repair. But they'd learned to be civil for Lily's sake, to co-parent even when every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. "I'll take care of her," Marcus had said gruffly, as if reading the anxiety written all over Sophie's face. "Don't worry about Lily, just go take care of your dad." And despite everything, despite their history, Sophie had no choice but to trust him. Because what else could she do? Now, standing in the airport bathroom, Sophie splashed cold water on her face, trying to wake herself up. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours. Her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, her body running on pure adrenaline and desperation. "Final boarding call for Flight 42 to Boston," a voice announced over the airport speakers. Sophie's heart lurched. No, 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 no. She grabbed her worn canvas bag and ran. She ran through the terminal, dodging travelers with roller bags and families moving at a leisurely pace. Her old sneakers slapped against the polished floor. Her lungs burned. She couldn't miss this flight. She couldn't. If she missed it, she might not make it in time. She might not get to say goodbye. "Wait!" she gasped as she reached the gate, where an attendant was literally about to close the door. "Please, please wait." The attendant, a middle-aged woman with severe glasses and a stern expression, looked up. For a moment, Sophie thought she was going to say no, that it was too late, that Sophie would have to wait for the next flight. But then something in the woman's expression softened. Maybe she saw the desperation in Sophie's eyes. Maybe she had her own dying parent somewhere. Maybe she was just having a good day. "You're cutting it close," the attendant said, scanning Sophie's boarding pass. "Seat 16B, hurry!" Sophie didn't need to be told twice. She rushed down the jet bridge, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. When she finally entered the plane, she was breathless, disheveled, and acutely aware that every passenger in first class was staring at her as she stumbled past them toward economy. Row 16? Where was row 16? She moved down the narrow aisle, searching for her seat, and then she froze. Because sitting in the window seat, looking like he'd stepped straight out of some luxury magazine, was possibly the most beautiful man Sophie had ever seen in her entire life. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Sophie made in 6 months. His crisp white shirt was unbuttoned just at the collar, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin. His thick black hair was styled in that effortlessly perfect way that rich people seem to manage, like he'd just run his hands through it, but it still looked intentional. And when he glanced up from the leather-bound book in his hands, Sophie found herself staring into the most striking gray eyes she'd ever seen. For a moment, just a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. Then reality crashed back in. This was her seat. She had to sit next to this man. This impossibly handsome, clearly wealthy, intimidatingly put-together man. While she looked like she'd been dragged through hell backwards. Perfect. Just perfect. Sophie tried to lift her bag into the overhead compartment, but her arms were shaking with exhaustion, and it was heavier than she remembered. She struggled with it, aware that she was holding up the line, aware that people behind her were getting impatient, aware that she probably looked completely incompetent. And then suddenly the man was standing. In one smooth, effortless motion, he took the bag from her trembling hands and lifted it into the compartment like it weighed absolutely nothing. "Allow me," he said in his voice. Oh God, His voice was smooth and deep with a subtle British accent that made Sophie's stomach do a strange little flip. She stood there, frozen, staring up at him. He was tall, really tall, and he smelled amazing, like expensive cologne and something else she couldn't quite identify. Something clean and masculine and completely overwhelming. "Thank you," Sophie managed to whisper, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. He gave her a slight nod and sat back down, returning to his book as if nothing had happened, as if he helped exhausted, struggling women every day. Maybe he did. Maybe this was just another Tuesday for him. Sophie slid into the middle seat. Of course it was the middle seat, because why would the universe give her anything else? And tried to make herself as small as possible. She didn't want to invade his space. She didn't want to bother him. She just wanted to disappear. As the plane taxied down the runway, Sophie stared out the window, watching Chicago disappear beneath them. She should have been thinking about her father, about what she would say to him, about whether she'd make it in time. She should have been worried about Lily, about whether Marcus would remember to pack her lunch for school, about whether her daughter would be okay without Aurora. But instead, all Sophie could think about was the warmth radiating from the man beside her, the subtle sound of pages turning, the way he seemed so calm, so composed, like nothing in the world could touch him. And she was so tired. Sophie tried to stay awake, she really did, but her eyelids grew heavier and heavier. The exhaustion she'd been fighting for days finally caught up with her. The gentle hum of the plane engines became a lullaby she couldn't resist. The last thing Sophie remembered was the sensation of the plane lifting off the ground, carrying her toward Boston, toward her father, toward a future she couldn't predict. And the warmth of something solid and steady beside her as her head gently, inevitably tilted to the side. When Sophie finally opened her eyes again, she had no idea how long she'd been asleep. The cabin was dimmer now, the lights turned down for the flight. She blinked slowly, confused, disoriented. And then she realized, with absolute, complete, soul-crushing horror, exactly where her head was resting. On the stranger's shoulder. On the beautiful, expensive suit-wearing, British-accented stranger's shoulder. She jerked upright so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. Something slid off her shoulders. His suit jacket, she realized with mounting mortification. He'd draped his jacket over her while she slept. "Oh my God," Sophie gasped, her face flooding with heat. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I can't believe oh." The man turned to look at her, and Sophie waited for the annoyance, the irritation, the disgust. She'd just used a complete stranger as a pillow for who knows how long, probably drooled on his expensive suit, definitely invaded his personal space in the most uncomfortable way possible. But when he looked at her, he didn't look annoyed at all. He smiled. Not a polite, forced smile. Not a smirk or a condescending grin. A real, genuine, warm smile that transformed his entire face and made something in Sophie's chest flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. "You needed the rest," he said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if people fell asleep on him and all the time, and he was perfectly fine with it. Sophie stared at him, completely at a loss for words. Who was this person? Who just let strangers sleep on them? Who gave up their jacket to keep someone warm? Who smiled like that, all gentle and understanding, when they had every right to be irritated? Before she could even begin to form a response, he reached up and pressed the call button above their seats. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly, and Sophie noticed the way the woman's eyes lit up when she saw him, the way she leaned in just a little bit closer than necessary. "Could we have some water, please?" he asked, his voice smooth and polite. "I can get my own water," Sophie protested weakly, still clutching his jacket in her lap. He turned those gray eyes on her, and one corner of his mouth quirked up in what might have been amusement. "I know," he said, "but I don't mind." And just like that, Sophie Mitchell's carefully constructed world, the one where she handled everything alone, where she didn't need help from anyone, where she was fine, always fine, no matter what, began to crack. Because this stranger, this beautiful, kind, impossibly perfect stranger, was offering her something she hadn't had in a very long time. Kindness. Simple, uncomplicated, genuine kindness. And Sophie, exhausted and emotional and scared about what waited for her in Boston, didn't know what to do with that at all. Sophie clutched the stranger's suit jacket in her lap, her fingers gripping the expensive fabric like it might anchor her to reality. The warmth from where it had draped over her shoulders still lingered on her skin, and she found herself both grateful and deeply embarrassed. "I really am so sorry," she said again, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to invade your space like that." The man studied her for a moment with those striking gray eyes, and Sophie felt like he was seeing right through her, through the exhaustion, through the fear, through all the walls she'd built up over the years. "I already told you," he said, his British accent making even simple words sound elegant. "It's fine. You look like you needed the rest." Sophie had no idea how to respond to that. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not from men who looked like they belonged on the cover of Forbes magazine, not in economy class on a Tuesday morning flight. The flight attendant returned with 2 bottles of water, and Sophie noticed again how the woman's entire demeanor changed when she looked at the man beside her. Her smile was warmer, her voice softer. "Here you go, Mr. Blackwood," she said sweetly, placing his water down with care. Then she turned to Sophie, and the temperature in her voice dropped about 10 degrees. "Miss." Sophie caught the shift, but said nothing. She just took the water with a quiet, "Thank you," and twisted the cap off, taking a long sip. The cool liquid felt good against her dry throat. As the flight attendant walked away, the man, Mr. Blackwood apparently, seemed to sense Sophie's discomfort. He closed his book and turned slightly toward her, and Sophie found herself meeting his gaze despite wanting to disappear into her seat. "Since you have already used me as a pillow," he said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice, "we might as well introduce ourselves properly. I'm Ryan Blackwood." He extended his hand and Sophie stared at it for a moment before reaching out to shake it. His palm was warm, his grip firm but gentle, and something about the simple gesture made her heart do that strange flutter in. "Sophie Mitchell," she managed to say, forcing a small smile. "Sophie," he repeated, like he was testing how her name sounded. "It's nice to meet you." She nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how she must look compared to him. Her faded jeans with the small tear in the knee, her worn-out sweater that had seen better days, her scuffed sneakers that were probably older than her daughter. Everything about her screamed struggle, while everything about him screamed success. "So Ryan," she said, trying to regain some composure, "are you heading to Boston for business or pleasure?" Ryan leaned back in his seat, and Sophie noticed how even that simple movement seemed effortless and controlled. "Neither really," he said with a slight smile. "More of an obligation." Sophie raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself, but she didn't push. She knew all about obligations. "What about you?" Ryan asked. "What brings you to Boston?" Sophie's grip on her water bottle tightened. "Family emergency," she admitted quietly, looking down at her lap. When she glanced back up, Ryan's expression had shifted. The amusement was gone, replaced by something softer, more genuine. "I'm sorry," he said, and he sounded like he actually meant it. Sophie forced another smile. "It's okay, I'm just hoping I get there in time." Ryan didn't ask for details, and Sophie was grateful for that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the low hum of the plane filling the space between them. Outside the window, the sky was an endless stretch of blue, peaceful and unchanging. Sophie hadn't expected this flight to be anything more than a means to an end, a stressful necessity, a race against time. She certainly hadn't expected to meet someone like Ryan Blackwood, and she had absolutely no idea that this chance encounter was about to change everything. Somewhere over Pennsylvania, the flight attendants began their beverage service. Sophie rubbed her hands over her face, feeling the exhaustion still pulling at her despite her unexpected nap. "Coffee?" Ryan asked, noticing the way she was blinking slowly like she was fighting to stay awake. Sophie nodded gratefully. "As much as they'll let me have." Ryan signaled the flight attendant, the same one from before, who appeared almost instantly with that too warm smile, and within minutes they both had steaming cups of coffee in front of them. Sophie wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth, and took a slow sip. The bitter liquid wasn't great, but it was something. Ryan watched her quietly for a moment, And then he said something that made Sophie nearly choke on her coffee. "You have a child, don't you?" Sophie's eyes went wide. "Excuse me?" Ryan smirked at her reaction, clearly enjoying her surprise. "You mentioned school fees in your sleep, and you have that look." "That look?" Sophie repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That I haven't slept properly in 7 years and caffeine is the only thing keeping me functional look," Ryan said, but his gray eyes glinting with amusement. Sophie couldn't help it. She snorted, a real laugh bubbling up despite everything. "Okay, that's that's actually fair," she admitted. She reached for her phone and pulled up her favorite picture of Lily, the one from her birthday party, where she was grinning at the camera with frosting on her nose. Sophie held it out to Ryan. "This is my daughter, Lily. She just turned 7. Ryan took the phone, and Sophie was surprised by how carefully he held it, how intently he studied the picture. "She has your eyes," he observed after a moment. Sophie smiled, a real smile this time. "Yeah, and her father's stubborn streak, unfortunately." "You two still together?" Ryan asked, his tone careful, not prying. Sophie shook her head. "No, we divorced 3 years ago. It was for the best." Ryan nodded like he understood, like he wasn't judging her for being a divorced single mother, barely keeping her head above water. "That's never easy," he said simply. "No," Sophie agreed, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "It's really not." A beat of silence passed between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then Ryan leaned back, stretching slightly, and Sophie noticed again how he seemed to take up space without being overwhelming. "I don't have kids," Ryan said, "but my younger brother has 3. I see that same exhausted look on his face every time I visit, so I think it runs in families." Sophie smiled. "Apparently so." There was something about the way Ryan spoke, calm and measured, but also guarded, like he'd learned to be careful with his words, like he was used to people wanting things from him. Sophie didn't push for more. She wasn't sure why she was even interested in knowing more about him, but something about Ryan Blackwood intrigued her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The plane suddenly lurched, hitting a patch of unexpected turbulence. Sophie's hands instinctively gripped the armrests, her knuckles going white. She wasn't usually afraid of flying, but this sudden drop in altitude sent her heart racing, all her anxiety about her father and Lily and everything else coming crashing back. Ryan must have noticed because without a word, without asking permission, he reached over and gently covered her hand with his. "Just turbulence," he said calmly, his voice steady and sure. "Nothing to worry about." His voice was so certain, so composed that Sophie felt her pulse begin to slow. She glanced down at their hands, his large and warm and completely steady, hers smaller and trembling slightly. She knew she should pull away, that this was too intimate for two strangers, but she didn't. She couldn't, because it had been so long since someone had offered her comfort like this, so long since someone had just been there, solid and steady, without asking for anything in return. The turbulence passed after a few minutes, but Ryan didn't immediately pull his hand away. And Sophie didn't ask him to. Eventually, as the captain announced they were beginning their descent into Boston, Ryan slowly withdrew his hand, and Sophie felt the loss of that warmth more than she wanted to admit. "Do you have a ride from the airport?" Ryan asked suddenly. Sophie blinked, pulled from her thoughts. No, I was just going to take a cab or an Uber or something." Ryan nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Let me give you my driver's number. He can take you wherever you need to go." Sophie frowned. "That's really not necessary. "I know you can," Ryan interrupted gently, "but I'd like to help anyway." Sophie hesitated. This felt like crossing some kind of line. This man had already been too kind, letting her sleep on him, getting her water, holding her hand through turbulence. And now he wanted to give her a ride. It was too much, wasn't it? But as she stared into Ryan's unwavering gray eyes, she realized something. She felt safe with him. In a way she hadn't felt safe with anyone in a very long time. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to accept help. Just this once. She exhaled slowly and nodded. "Okay. Thank you." Ryan pulled out a sleek business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. Sophie took it, glancing down at the elegant lettering embossed on thick cardstock. Ryan Blackwood. Blackwood International Holdings. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the card, then looked up at Ryan, then back down at the card. Blackwood International Holdings. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. It was one of the biggest investment firms in the country, known for billion-dollar acquisitions and market-shifting decisions. Ryan Blackwood wasn't just some wealthy businessman. He was one of the most powerful corporate figures in the entire country, and she just drooled on his shoulder for 2 hours. Business consulting, huh? Sophie said dryly, raising an eyebrow at him. Ryan had the grace to look slightly amused. I may have understated things a bit. Sophie shook her head, half exasperated, half impressed, and completely overwhelmed. She should have been intimidated. She should have felt even more out of place than she already did. But all she could think was, what the hell did I just get myself into? The plane touched down smoothly at Boston Logan International Airport, and passengers began gathering their belongings. But Sophie sat still for a moment, staring at the business card in her hand, trying to process everything that had just happened. You okay? Ryan's voice pulled her back to the present. Sophie looked up at him. You didn't mention you were basically a financial titan. Ryan chuckled, a low, rich sound that did things to Sophie's stomach she absolutely did not have time to analyze. I find that introductions go more smoothly when I don't lead with that information. Sophie smirked despite herself. Right, because business consultant sounds way less intimidating than billionaire who probably owns half of Boston. Ryan shrugged lazily. It served its purpose. As the line of passengers began shuffling toward the exit, Ryan stood and effortlessly pulled down both their bags from the overhead compartment. He handed Sophie hers without a word, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, Sophie murmured, still trying to wrap her head around everything. My driver's waiting outside, Ryan said, as they made their way off the plane. Come with me. He'll take you wherever you need to go. Sophie should have said no. She should have thanked him politely and gone her separate way. This man had already done more than enough for her. But when she thought about scrambling to get a key, rushing through a city she hadn't seen in 2 years, her nerves already frayed from what awaited her at the hospital, and then she thought about Ryan's steady presence, the way he'd calmed her on the plane, the way he'd never once made her feel small or less than, despite how obviously different their lives were. Finally, she nodded. Okay. Ryan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gray eyes, something Sophie couldn't quite read. And just like that, Sophie Mitchell left the airport with a man who had the power to change her life forever. Outside, Boston's cold air hit her like a physical wave. The city was alive and chaotic, horns blaring, lights flashing, taxis weaving aggressively through traffic, people shouting, the constant hum of urban life. It was overwhelming in a way Chicago had never been. Ryan's driver was already waiting at the curb beside a sleek black Mercedes that probably cost more than Sophie would make in 5 years. The driver, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a black suit, nodded respectfully at Ryan before opening the rear door. Sophie hesitated for just half a second before sliding in. The interior was pure luxury, soft leather seats, the faint scent of expensive cologne, the smooth, quiet purr of the engine. She felt completely and utterly out of place. Ryan slid in beside her, settling into the seat with that same effortless confidence that seemed to define everything about him. Where to? The driver asked, his voice professional and neutral. Boston General Hospital, Sophie answered quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's gaze flickered toward her, but he didn't ask questions. He didn't push. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaos of Boston traffic. For the first few minutes, they sat in silence. Sophie stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, memories rushing back with each landmark. She'd grown up in this city. She knew these streets, but after years in Chicago, it felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. Then Ryan spoke, his voice gentle. Do you have someone waiting for you at the hospital? Sophie exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the window slightly. My uncle. He's the one who called me, told me about my father. Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable. How long has your father been sick? Sophie hesitated. She wasn't used to sharing this kind of thing with anyone, let alone a billionaire she just met on a plane. But something about Ryan made her want to answer. made her feel like it was safe to be honest. He was diagnosed 8 months ago, she admitted quietly. But he always sounded so strong on the phone, so optimistic. He kept telling me not to worry, that he was fighting, that he'd beat it. Her voice wavered slightly. I thought I had more time. You would have come sooner if you could, Ryan said evenly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, like he understood without her having to explain about the money, about the struggles, about all the reasons she'd failed to visit her dying father. Sophie looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Yeah, I would have. You're here now, Ryan said simply. That's what matters. Sophie swallowed hard, fighting against the tears that suddenly threatened to spill over. For the first time since getting Uncle Robert's phone call, she allowed herself to breathe. Really breathe. When they pulled up to the hospital entrance, Sophie's heart began to pound. This was it. In a few minutes, she'd walk through those doors and see her father, sick and frail and fighting for his life. She'd have to be strong. She'd have to hold it together. Thank you for the ride, Sophie said, reaching for the door handle, ready to escape before she completely fell apart in front of this man. But before she could step out, Ryan's voice stopped her. Sophie. She turned, surprised to find something different in his expression. Something softer, more open than she'd seen during the entire flight. If you need anything, anything at all, call me, he said. Sophie blinked. Ryan, you don't have to. I know, he cut in smoothly, his gray eyes holding hers. But I want to. Sophie stared at him. She'd spent years learning how to handle everything alone, years figuring things out by herself, because that's what you did when you were a single mother with no support system. You didn't need help. You didn't accept charity. You just survived. But something about Ryan Blackwood told her that maybe, just maybe, letting someone help wasn't the worst thing in the world. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay. Ryan Aziz held hers for a moment longer, and then he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out another card. This one looks slightly different from the first. This one has my personal number, he said, handing it to her. Not my office, man. Sophie hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. The touch sent a small spark through her, and she quickly pulled her hand back, clutching the card. Take care of yourself, Sophie, Ryan said, his voice quiet but firm. And with that, Sophie stepped out of the car and into the cold Boston air. As she walked toward the hospital entrance, she could feel Ryan's gaze on her back. But she didn't turn around, because somehow, deep in her gut, she knew this wasn't the last time she would see Ryan Blackwood. Not even close. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital corridors, beeping machines, and hushed conversations with doctors who used too many medical terms. Sophie's father was stable, for now. But stable didn't mean better. It just meant he was still fighting. Sophie spent every waking moment at his bedside, holding his hand, talking to him even when he was too tired to respond. Uncle Robert was a constant presence, bringing coffee and food that Sophie barely touched, offering support when she felt like she might break apart completely. But through it all, Ryan stayed in touch. The first text came that night. Just checking in. How's your father? Sophie had stared at her phone, surprised. She'd expected Ryan to disappear back into his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. But here he was, checking on her, caring. She typed back, stable for now. It was a long night, but I'm grateful he's still here. His response came almost immediately. I'm glad to hear that. I meant what I said. If you need anything, let me know. Sophie had found herself smiling, a real, unexpected smile. You really don't have to keep checking on me, you know. Ryan, I know, and that was it, just I know. But somehow those two words said everything. The text continued over the next few days, never intrusive, never demanding, just there, a steady presence in the chaos of her life. And then, 3 days after she'd arrived in Boston, her phone rang. It was Ryan. Not a text this time, an actual call. Sophie stepped out into the hospital hallway before answering, her heart doing that strange flutter thing again. Hey, she said, trying to keep her voice casual. Hey, Ryan's smooth British accent came through the line. I was thinking, have you eaten today? Sophie blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. Not really. I've been at the hospital all day. That's what I thought, Ryan said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. So here's what's going to happen. I'm sending a car to pick you up in 15 minutes. We're having breakfast. Wait, what? Sophie sputtered. Ryan, I can't just leave. My father is stable and you need to take care of yourself too. Ryan interrupted smoothly. I'm not asking you to disappear for hours. Just take a break. I'll have you back before your father even notices you're gone. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, to explain that she couldn't, that she shouldn't, that it wasn't appropriate. But before she could get the words out, Ryan's voice softened. Sophie, when was the last time you did something for yourself? The question hit her like a punch to the gut, because the truth was she couldn't remember. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything that wasn't about survival, about Lily, about making ends meet, about keeping her head above water. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but just 1 hour, that's it. She could hear Ryan's smile through the phone. I'll take what I can get. See you soon, Sophie. 15 minutes later, Sophie found herself sliding into the back of that same black Mercedes, her stomach tied in knots. What was she doing? She should be at the hospital. She should be with her father. But Uncle Robert had practically pushed her out the door, insisting she needed a break, needed to breathe. The car pulled up in front of an elegant cafe tucked between towering glass buildings in downtown Boston. It wasn't one of those absurdly fancy places with white tablecloths and waiters in tuxedos, but it was still far nicer than anywhere Sophie had been in years. And there, waiting outside, was Ryan Blackwood, still in a perfectly tailored suit, still impossibly composed, still looking like he'd stepped out of a different world entirely. You made it, he said, that warm smile appearing on his face. Sophie crossed her arms, trying to regain some sense of control. I don't recall having much of a choice, Ryan smirked. You always have a choice, Sophie. She narrowed her eyes at him, but followed him inside anyway. The hostess led them to a private booth in the back, away from curious eyes, and within minutes a perfectly dressed waiter appeared with menus. The usual, Mr. Blackwood? The waiter asked with a knowing smile. Sophie raised an eyebrow. The usual, huh? Yes, Ryan said smoothly. And for her, bring a latte and the breakfast platter. Sophie blinked. Wow, just making my choices for me now? Ryan leaned back, studying her with those gray eyes. You look like you desperately need caffeine and actual food. Was I wrong? Sophie opened her mouth to argue, then shut it. Damn it, he wasn't wrong. She was exhausted and starving and running on nothing but hospital coffee and sheer willpower. Fine, she muttered, but don't make a habit of it. Ryan's smirk deepened and Sophie realized he'd won this round. When the food arrived, Sophie was shamelessly hungry. She barely waited for the waiter to set down the plate before digging in. French toast, bacon, fresh fruit. It was the best thing she'd tasted in days. So, Ryan said after a few minutes, watching her eat with what might have been amusement. Tell me something real about yourself. Sophie swallowed her bite, confused. We're doing this again? Yes, Ryan said simply, because I have a feeling you rarely let people in. He wasn't wrong. Sophie took a sip of her latte, which was absolutely incredible, and stalled. Finally, she said, I used to want to be a journalist. Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly, like he hadn't expected that. What happened? Sophie exhaled, setting down her cup. Life happened. I got pregnant with Lily when I was 25. My plans changed. I had to figure out how to survive instead of how to chase dreams. Ryan didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then softly he said, That doesn't mean you have to give up on those dreams entirely. Sophie looked up, something sharp twisting in her chest. It's a little late for that, Ryan. Is it? Ryan asked, his gray eyes holding hers. I don't believe that. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. Easy for you to say. You probably always knew you'd be successful. You probably had a plan from day one. Ryan went very quiet for a moment. Then he said something that completely shocked her. I wasn't born into wealth, Sophie. Sophie froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. What? Ryan leaned forward slightly. I grew up in a tiny apartment in South London. My father worked in a factory. My mother was a nurse. We had enough to get by, but not much more than that. I learned very early that if I wanted something different, I had to build it myself. From nothing. Sophie stared at him. I'm completely caught off guard. She'd assumed, like everyone probably assumed, that Ryan was born into privilege, that he'd always been one of those people who had everything handed to them on a silver platter. But hearing this, it changed everything. It made him real. It made him human. Why didn't you ever tell me that? Sophie asked quietly. Ryan shrugged. You never asked. And honestly, most people don't care. They just see the suit and the money and assume that's all there is. Sophie set down her cup, studying him with new eyes. I'm sorry for assuming. Don't be, Ryan said. Everyone does. But I'm telling you now because I want you to understand something. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. Dreams don't have expiration dates, Sophie. You're 32, not 90. You have time. You have talent. You just need someone to believe in you. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not now. But Ryan wasn't done. I have an idea, he said. Sophie tensed. Why do I feel like I should be worried? Ryan ignored that. You said you wanted to be a journalist, right? Yeah, but Ryan, what if I gave you a job? Sophie's brain short-circuited. What? Not at Blackwood International, Ryan clarified quickly. I own a media company, one of the biggest independent digital news outlets in the country. I can get you in. Sophie's stomach dropped. This was insane. Ryan, you don't even know if I'm good at it. Ryan tilted his head slightly. I know you're smart. I know you're driven. And I know you don't belong to waiting tables for the rest of your life. Sophie felt overwhelmed, her heart racing. This was too much. It was all too much. Why would you do this for me? She whispered. Ryan's gaze held hers, steady and sure. Because I believe in second chances. Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. For years, Sophie had convinced herself that this was it, that her dreams had died when Lily was born, that she wasn't meant for anything more than surviving day to day. But now, sitting across from Ryan Blackwood in this beautiful cafe in downtown Boston, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. 2 days later, Sophie's phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? She answered cautiously. Is this Sophie Mitchell? The voice was crisp, professional, female. Yes. Who's this? My name is Charlotte Grant. I'm the editor-in-chief at Blackwood Media. Ryan Blackwood asked me to reach out to you. Sophie's heart stopped. He'd actually done it. He'd actually followed through. Charlotte continued. I'll be honest, I don't usually entertain favors. But I read some of the articles you wrote in college, the ones Ryan sent me. You have raw talent, Sophie. So here's the deal. There's a staff writer position open. No handouts, no special treatment. You'll have to prove yourself. But if you're serious about journalism, this is your shot. Sophie's mouth went dry. This was real. This was actually happening. I don't know what to say, Sophie admitted. Say yes, Charlotte said bluntly. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer disappears. The line went dead. Sophie sat there in the hospital waiting room, phone in her lap, her entire world tilting on its axis. She had a choice to make. And for the first time in years, the future felt terrifyingly, thrillingly wide open. That night, after hours of agonizing internal debate, Sophie called Charlotte back. I'll take it, she said, her voice shaking but determined. Good choice, Charlotte replied. See you Monday morning. And just like that, Sophie Mitchell's life changed. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Sophie's father stabilized enough that she felt comfortable starting her new job. She moved into a small apartment in Boston. Arrangements were made for Lily to visit on weekends. And suddenly, Sophie found herself walking into Blackwood Media headquarters on a Monday morning, her heart in her throat. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel and ambition. The newsroom buzzed with controlled chaos, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, reporters chasing deadlines with an intensity Sophie recognized from her college journalism days. Charlotte Grant met her at the elevator, all business. This is your desk, she said, gesturing to a workspace that was small but real. I expect you to prove yourself, Sophie. Ryan might have opened the door, But if you can't deliver, you won't last here. Sophie lifted her chin. I wouldn't expect anything less. Charlotte's lips quirked in what might have been approval. Good. Now get to work. And Sophie did. She threw herself into the job with everything she had, writing articles about local politics, human interest stories, investigative pieces. She was rusty at first. Years away from journalism had dulled some of her skills. But slowly, steadily, she found her rhythm again. And through it all, Ryan was there, not hovering, not micromanaging, just present. Text messages, checking in. Coffee dates between her deadlines and his board meetings. Dinners that turned into hours of conversation about everything and nothing. One night, about a month after she'd started at Blackwood Media, Sophie's phone buzzed as she was leaving the office. Ryan, dinner tonight? You owe me for the bomb hookup. Sophie smirked, typing back, oh, so now I owe you. Ryan, absolutely. One dinner, that's all I'm asking. Sophie, fine, but that's it. Ryan, we'll see. Sophie shook her head, but she was smiling as she walked toward the restaurant Ryan had suggested. Because the truth was, she wanted to see him. She wanted to spend time with him. And that realization was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Over dinner, at a restaurant that was nice but not absurdly fancy, they talked about work, about life, about Sophie's father who was slowly recovering. And then Ryan said something that made her heart skip a beat. I want to see you again, he said simply. Not just as friends. I want to actually date you, Sophie. Sophie's breath caught. Ryan, I'm not asking for anything you are not ready to give, he interrupted gently. I just want a chance. That's all. Sophie stared at him, her mind racing. This was a bad idea. A very bad idea. Ryan Blackwood lived in a completely different world than she did. He was a billionaire. She was a single mother still struggling to make rent. They didn't make sense, but when she looked into his gray eyes and saw the honesty there, the genuine care, she realized something important. Maybe they didn't have to make sense. Maybe sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. Okay, Sophie whispered, one real date. Let's see what happens. Ryan smiled, that genuine, warm smile that had first caught her attention on the plane, and reached across the table to take her hand. That's all I need, he said. And sitting there in a restaurant in Boston, holding hands with a man who had changed her life in ways she never expected, Sophie Mitchell realized something profound. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And for the first time in years, the future didn't look like an endless struggle. It looked like possibility, like hope, like a second chance she never thought she'd get. Sophie knew there were still challenges ahead. Marcus's threatening phone call still loomed. Her father's health remained fragile. Ryan's ex-fiancée, Vanessa, had emerged as a complication. And navigating a relationship between their two vastly different worlds wouldn't be easy. But as Ryan squeezed her hand gently and smiled at her across the table, Sophie decided something important. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the smallest moments. A chance encounter on a plane, a stranger's kindness, the courage to accept help when you've spent years refusing it. Sophie Mitchell boarded Flight 42 to Boston, thinking she was racing toward an ending. Instead, she found a beginning. And in Ryan Blackwood, she found not just a rescuer, but a partner who believed she was worth saving. Not because she needed it, but because she deserved it. This is the story of second chances, of dreams deferred but not destroyed, of learning that sometimes letting someone in isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do.